Chapter 10, No Time to Lose, read by Mrs. Spears. There were 3 of the humans. They were eating. It had to be said that their food smelled pretty good. Their voices rose and fell in conversation and laughter. The tree chewers rested nearby. Their words sounded like gibberish, but Tsetsa listened to the sounds they were making. Now that it was quiet, they spoke calmly to one another, as if nothing had happened. A stray breezelet lifted an intoxicating scent to her nose. It was both sweet and savory, both nutty and new. It was irresistible and maybe even magical because without even knowing how it happened, she found herself down on the ground, within harvesting distance. Whoa, she thought. How did that happen? She froze, hoping they had not seen her. But one of them turned and looked right into her eyes and spoke. Blah, 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 it said. The other 2 turned their heads then, and now they were all watching. Blah, 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 said one of them. The first one spoke again to Tsetsa. Blah, 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 it asked. It tore off a piece of its food and tossed it toward her gently. It landed at her feet. The aroma was overpowering. Tsetsa looked at that human, then at the others. The one that had tossed the food took another bite, and while still chewing, said, blah, 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 blah. Tsetsa took the bit of food in her mouth and ran to the nearest tree, up the trunk, onto a high, safe limb. Blah, 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 one of them called after her. And then laughter. Her heart was racing, and she took the food in her paws while she calmed herself. She took deep, slow breaths in and out. She tried to empty her mind. While her mind was emptying, her paws lifted the food to her mouth, and she bit into it. Oh my. Wow. It was delicious. What was this brown, creamy stuff? She had never tasted anything quite like it. She licked at her paws where some of the stuff had stuck. She looked back at the humans. What were they up to? She didn't like hawks and she didn't like wolves, but she understood them. This was more confusing. With a fluttering of wings, a young screech owl settled down next to her. Look at them, screeched the angry bird. Hoodlums! Barbarians! She blinked in the unfiltered sunlight. She had been sleeping, though poorly, when her home split in 2. What kind of wild beasts are they? She sputtered. Maybe they will build some kind of nest now, said Tsetsa. Maybe the destruction is over. No, said a familiar voice on the other side of her. Tsetsa whipped around. It was Jed. Jed, she cried, where have you been? What took you so long? Where's Chai? Before he could answer, she hugged him hard around his middle. I'm just so glad to see you, she said, half into his fur. Jed couldn't help laughing, but he had no good news. I haven't seen Chai, he said. Not yet, and I don't think it's over. The humans aren't finished. They're going to keep going as soon as they've eaten. Look. Tsetsa looked where he was pointing and saw that it wasn't just this grove that had been dismantled. There was a long furrow of empty air as far as she could see. Empty, that is, except for the buzz paths and the frozen spider webs. They're making a desert all along the buzz paths, said Jed. Why are they doing that? Asked Tsetsa. What for? Jed shrugged. Beats me, he said. Who knows? Footnote. They were doing it to prevent the trees from bumping against or severing the power lines, which can cause all kinds of problems, including fires. But how is a squirrel to know that, let alone an owl? They're doing it because they're idiots, said the screech owl. but at least they will move on now and leave us alone. She fluffed up and resettled, then swiveled her head around to look at the forest behind her. I only hope all the good cavities aren't already taken, she said. Our situation is a little different, Setsa said, thoughtfully. She couldn't believe that within minutes of sharing food with a human, she was having a conversation with an owl. Screech owls were small and did not eat squirrels most of the time. But you didn't talk with them. That's what disasters do sometimes. They throw us together with those who are our adversaries, who play for a different team. For a short time, a common enemy dissolves our differences and makes us realize what we share until someone gets hungry. Setsa thought about what Jed had said, a desert all along the buzz paths. If that was true, then their own home was in peril. Well, we're from further up the buzz paths, she said. Our families... Her voice broke, and she hid her face in her paws. She had been brave so far, but saying those words out loud opened a floodgate inside of her. How blithely she had left them all behind. But she'd never planned to leave them forever. And what would happen now? Her shoulders shook. Jed looked at her in surprise. He hadn't made the connection yet between the buzz path and the unexpected appearance of his friends. Wait, he said. You mean these are the same buzz paths? Our buzz paths? Is that how you guys found me? Setsa nodded, her face still buried. I climbed to the treetop, she whispered. I watched you fall from the hawk. I counted the objects. Well, of course, thought Jed. Everything had happened so fast. Events had tumbled over him helter-skelter. He hadn't had time to make sense of them, but now he could see it. Of course it was the buzz paths. How else could Chai and Setsa ever have found him? Setsa was weeping quietly. Jed took her paw and squeezed it. Oh, it's okay, he said. Don't cry. Why not? Asked Setsa in a quavering voice. It was a good question. Jed didn't have an answer except maybe, because if you keep crying, I might cry too. Instead, he asked gently, how many objects were there? How far did you come? He asked because he wanted to know, but also because sometimes getting someone who is upset to think about numbers can help them feel calm. 3, sobbed Setsa. 3 objects. She began to sob harder. The calming by numbers wasn't working yet. The screech owl turned her head sideways to observe them. There's no use in blubbering, she said. Get on with it. Find a hole. Look for food. She fluttered to the next limb. It is what it is, they heard her say. Then another rustle of wings, and more distantly, move on. Get a grip. Deal with it. Setsa's sobs were subsiding, but she was still distressed. You move on, she muttered. Stupid owl. Oh, sorry. I guess that's redundant. So much for interspecies harmony. Think of it this way, Setsa, said Jed. It's really lucky that we're here right now, that we saw all of this, because we can go back home and warn everyone, but we have to go now. There's no time to lose. This had just popped into his head, and he only said it for something to say. But it was a sensible idea, and it shone like a ray of sunlight that finds its way into a dark cave. The light showed Setsa a path out of her despair. Because she was a creature of action, she wiped at her eyes with the back of her paws. She squared her shoulders. Okay, she said. What about Chai, though? We have to find him. She turned and scanned the trees. Right, said Jed. Absolutely. We have to find Chai. He didn't know how on earth they could do it, but maybe the answer to that would pop into his head too.